All right, who's ready for Chapter 2? We're going to talk about McGeough Chapter 2, Visual Composition and Design, where we really get into the building blocks of visual communication. All the elements of visual communication and images are built on the fundamental foundations of a lot of the items that are in this sort of pink design that you see on the left. Lines, dots, colors, saturations, all that sort of stuff. So let's get into it. So the building blocks of communication, visual images, they're really, even the most complex images are comprised of a few really like simple components. Number one is the composition of how an image is set up. And then within that we have things like dots, lines, and shapes. Everything is a dot, a line, or a shape, everything. They might not be a normal, shape that we think of, a square, perfect rectangle, perfect circle, whatever it might be. But every single thing is a dot, a line, or a shape that we perceive. Within that, there's some studies of how certain visual ideas are put across, and then is Gestalt, which we'll break that down. In addition, everything that we can view is seen as a color. And again, it might not be your primary colors you ever think about. It might be a dull off green, brownish tan. It might not be what you think of as a vibrant color, but that is a color. And then other things that we perceive from images, even still images, is depth and motion. So really all visual images have some element of this, or the absence of some of these elements that in itself communicate something visually. So number one, let's talk about composition. Composition is how a visual element is situated within a frame. And a lot of times, we might just be taking snapshots, not a lot of intention behind how a thing is being presented within the frame that we're using with our phone or camera if we have one of those. But how and where the contents of an image are placed within the frame can change how viewers interpret the image. A couple of the key things you do want to know about, because you will probably hear, or you probably have already heard about them a lot if you've ever taken any sort of art course, media course, anything of that nature. Number one is the rule of thirds. A lack of balance makes an image more visually interesting. If you see in this image we've shown this mother and her baby, their heads and their faces are not perfectly situated in the center of the frame. You see that the baby's face is situated in the upper right sort of corner. She is in her eye line is kind of even with the upper line when we break it up laterally. So it makes it more visually interesting to kind of have them offset slightly, even though it is a relatively simple picture. The other is frame magnetism. So the nearer an image is to the edge of a frame, the stronger the object seems to be pulled towards that edge, and that creates a sense of tension. So if you've ever seen a picture where there's one person's face on one side and one person's face on the other side, it creates an idea that they are on opposite sides. It creates that tension. Whereas here you can see this is exactly the opposite. The frame magnetism, the nearer they are to the center, the less tension there is. The more they seem as if they are one, as if they are, united, which I'm sure in this case, mother and a child are. But frame magnetism works both ways. The farther out to the frame it is, the more it creates a sense of tension. The closer the images are to the center, the more it creates a sense of cohesion. And composition shows up even when it's not intentional. If you're just trying to take a picture and you roughly center something in your picture or something like that, it still shows the way that you framed it, what you chose to put in the image. Even if you're not making a very deep artistic decision, you still made a decision that this thing is worth taking a picture of, that I'm only going to take, the top half of the body rather than the bottom half of the body, because you figure the top half is more important and a photo's bottom half of somebody's body is weird. But composition comes into play regardless of whether we're doing it on purpose. You know, the rule of thirds and frame magnetism happen for a viewer regardless of whether they're looking for that frame magnetism or they're looking for that rule of thirds. The image becomes more interesting because of the rule of thirds, not because the viewer is saying, I'm looking for the rule of thirds. It's just the way that we perceive it in our brains. So the most basic and fundamental building block of visual communication is a dot. Place a dot anywhere on an image. If it's just a plain white piece of paper, put a dot. Your eye is naturally going to be drawn to it. You can't help it. It's just, okay, there's something for me to look at. Your brain wants to look at it. And everything that you have, your phone, your TV, anything with a screen is just made up of a series of dots. They're called pixels. If you've ever heard, 1080p, that means that's how many pixels per a given square dimension of measurement. So it's almost everything that you're looking at nowadays, this computer screen or phone screen or tablet screen, whatever you're looking at, is just made up of a series of tiny little dots that are so small and so numerous that to your eye they create a coherent whole, but they're really just dots. Next up from the line of dots is lines. And lines, again, it's just a series of dots. You're drawing a line across a piece of paper, but you can get the same effect by putting teeny tiny little dots over and over and over again to create the impression of a continuous line. And even within lines, again, something as super simple as just a pencil across a page can create its own set of feelings and emotions. Horizontal lines evoke stability. Why is that? Well, it's because the horizon, the ground, as we look at it, as we look off in the distance, the ground is horizontal. So when we see a horizontal line written on a page, we perceive from our evolution that is sort of similar to the ground, a thing that's solid, a thing that is not going anywhere, a thing that is constant. Vertical lines, however, evoke energy. All right, because think trees. They grow up and they're growing. Right, they're going upwards. If we see someone that is standing up, we perceive them as having energy, as opposed to someone who's lying down. We perceive that as a lack of energy. So vertical lines tend to evoke energy, and then diagonal lines indicate a state of flux, that things are changing. So if something is quickly moving up, we perceive a lot of flux, a lot of change. Whereas something is kind of gradually diagonally going upwards, we perceive a more gradual, a less dramatic state of flux. So lines, just the position that a line is in, can drastically change how we feel about the image that we're looking at. And we'll get into that a lot more when we start looking at specific iconic images from history. We go from dots to lines to now shapes. Shapes are a visual pattern that we recognize, okay? So we recognize things like rectangle, square, circle, triangle, all those sorts of things that you studied in geometry or even, first grade. Beyond that, we recognize shapes that are not perfect shapes. So, for instance, we recognize mountains are generally triangular. Usually, mountains are not perfectly triangular, right? You perceive if you were looking down aerially at a pond in a forest, you might say that pond is circular or roughly an oval. It's certainly not a perfect oval, right? They'll have little nooks and crannies and all, but you can look at it and say roughly it's oval. So shapes, it's generally a pattern that we can recognize to make sense of things around us, so that we can kind of like look out and see, okay, there's a lake, there's a mountain, there's the sky, there's the sun. The sun is roughly circular, that mountain is roughly triangular, the ground is roughly rectangular, that lake is roughly circular or an oval shape. And it helps us to kind of select and perceive, remember those terms from earlier, of that information, so that we can focus on the more important thing. Like we don't have to figure out exactly what shape the lake is in order for us to focus on the bear that is maybe standing beside that lake, so that we know to not go towards that bear, right? Because the purpose of us recognizing these things at the end of the day, for us as when we were cavemen, it was for us to survive, to not get killed, and to find things that could help us stay alive. So Gestalt, a funny word, maybe not as self-explanatory as, when we're talking about dots or colors or anything like this. But Gestalt is an idea that has 5 kind of principles, and they are similarity, proximity, continuation, closure, and common fate. And we'll get into each one of those individually in a moment. But under Gestalt, the belief is that perception is a result of complex combinations of visual stimuli, that there's a lot of things going into the ways that we perceive all these shapes, colors, lines, dots, all that kind of stuff. And that how the brain processes these combinations leads to new perceptions, okay? How we perceive a whole can't be described simply by describing the visual elements that make up an image. Okay, we can't just say it was blue and there's triangles and understand what that image is about, any more so than I can say, Jim is white with blonde hair and he likes to wear green sweatshirts, right? Like that can't describe Jim. It's the same thing with a visual, with an image. So the first element of Gestalt I want to talk about is similarity. And this is something that we take for granted in our daily lives. It's just something that we kind of automatically do. You can even take a very young child, give them a collection of, let's say, blocks, that have certain similarities, and they might start to line them up, according to their similarities. It's very interesting, but we tend to mentally group things that are similar in appearance. So look at this image right in front of you. You probably perceive this as, let's say, a field of blue with yellow lines on it, all right? Or maybe you perceive it as, yellow lines and blue lines interchangeably. The idea is, though, that you perceive there to be 2 different sets of lines. You perceive there to be lines, when really it's just a bunch of square tiles, right? So in this case, it's color, but similarities may be size, shape, color, location, any sort of things that are similar. We tend to perceive them as a set, and that is the similarity aspect of Gestalt. Another element of Gestalt is proximity, where we tend to recognize things that are closer together as being parts of groups. If you look at this image, you may perceive one group of red stars on one side of the frame, and on the other side, one red star that's kind of separated from that group, right? If you look at the group on the left, they're different sizes. Some are in out of focus, so they're probably not like sitting right next to each other necessarily. So why do we perceive them as groups? Well, because of proximity, right? There's a big space between the ones on the left and the one on the right. So we tend to say, okay, there's 2 groups of stars here. It's a subset of similarity. The similarity in this case is location within the frame. So despite, these stars being the same color, same shape, roughly the same size, not drastically different, we still tend to perceive them as being in 2 groups under the concept of proximity. Next item in Gestalt to look at is continuation. It's that our brains assume that a line or an object continues even when we can no longer see it. So look at this image and ask yourself, the blue arrows, how many blue arrow lines are there on this screen? You probably say 2, right? Even though there's multiple points where those blue arrow lines are being covered up by other lines. That's the concept of continuation. That we look at that blue arrow line moving, it goes under the gray line, under the brown line, and comes back up. It doesn't just cease to exist just because the gray line or the brown line is on top of it. We just assume that it continues around. And this is from evolution and experience that teach us that objects don't disappear just because we don't see them anymore. And again, this comes back to the idea of like evolutionarily surviving. If we're running away from a wolf, We don't assume that because we jump on the other side of a rock and we can't see the wolf anymore, that we don't have to worry about it, that it no longer exists, right? We have that continuation in our mind that like, oh, it's there, it's gonna get us. Likewise, if we're chasing a rabbit or a deer or something like that, we don't assume that because the rabbit ran behind a tree and then ran out the other side, that all of a sudden it's a different rabbit. Right? We assume that just that same rabbit, and we're tracking it. So these are evolutionary things that we built up in order to survive in this world. So related to continuation, we have closure. And both of those ideas come from the place that even though you can't see all of an image, or you may have momentarily no longer seen an image, you don't assume that it just totally ceased to exist. Continuation, though, is more of the idea of something going along a path and then maybe being obscured for a bit, and then you see it again, and you understand that it didn't just cease to exist for those few moments and then come back into existence. That object permanence is something we do kind of develop as humans. But closure is kind of the idea that if part of an image is obscured, we fill in that information to complete the shape. And closure is a little bit more reliant on experience than continuation is. So generally speaking, if a young baby, if their mother leaves the room and comes back, they tend to, as they get older, understand the idea of the continuation of the mother. She's not just blinking out of existence and coming back. They get that. Like that, it's kind of something that will come naturally. With closure, understanding closure much more than continuation relies on being familiar with a shape. So if you look at this image, for instance, if you have come from a culture where travel camping trailers are not a regular thing, right? You might look at this picture and have no idea what this image is, or have an idea of how large it is or anything like that. Whereas if you've ever seen a camper before, you can look at this image and you can kind of make inferences about how large this image is. You recognize, oh yeah, this is a camper trailer, right? You kind of, whereas someone who is a native person in South America who's maybe like, they could not make that inference without it. Furthermore, you can only see the head and the hands of this girl. The idea of closure is that you understand that there is a lower half to her body. Perhaps there's not. She might be in a wheelchair, she might have something else, but from experience, you are familiar with what a human body looks like. You are familiar with how, a young child might, be giggling and looking out of a trailer window while they're camping or something like that. So you can make an inference to assume the rest of that lower body is below that window. And then other things you can make inferences about. You can make like, you know what? If you turn around, you look around the next moment, that little girl might be gone and running around somewhere else. And this is all things that you have from how familiar you are with these objects, with hanging, little kids and their tendencies and all those sorts of things. Another item of Gestalt I want to talk about is common fate. Again, a lot of these are related, so you might say this is a little bit similar to continuation. But in the case of the common fate, you just see things that are moving in the same direction as part of a group. So look at this, picture of a racetrack. You perceive them here. There's a group of lanes that are going straight, and there's a group of lanes that are turning. They're all on the same surface. They're all written with the same kind of line paint. But you see two separate sets because of the idea that they have two separate common fates, that they're going in a similar direction. All right. So we talked about Gestalt. And Gestalt is really, I guess maybe you could say the most complicated of the ones of these ideas. A lot of these other ones you're going to recognize if you ever did kindergarten or nursery school or anything like that. We're just going to think about them a little bit differently. Gestalt is really the one though that has bigger words, more college-y sounding words. But now we're going to get back into the ones that I think you might be a little bit more familiar with. So color, obviously. But color has a really a wide array of psychological and physiological effects on us. So as an example, like red transcends culture. Almost every civilization we've ever known came up with a word for red and understood red as an important color. It might be because of the association with blood, but every culture has a word for red. And then other colors like blue and yellow and those sort of things tend to come along later, if at all. There's a lot of languages, even today, that do not have words for orange, do not have words for purple. In fact, those words, even in English language, were very rare until relatively recently in human history. The color violet is named after the violet flower. The color orange is named after the fruit orange. Because there was no independent word for those colors. It was just, well, this is colored like an orange, so the color became orange. Previously to that, it would be called, okay, this is dark yellow or light red. Instead of pink, you would say it was light red. Purple, a lot of times was described as being like very dark blue or reddish blue. That's why the rhyme goes, roses are red, violets are blue. Because at that time, there was no word for what a violet is. There was no purple. The most you could say about what color a violet is that it was violet. So it's an interesting etymology thing that every language virtually starts with and has a letter for red and fills in other names for colors as things go on. So within the elements of color, we start with hue, and hue is a particular color. This is how the light reflects off the object. Depending on that wavelength, it's how it is sensed going into your eyeball. So a hue is red, green, blue, those sorts of things. That's your hue. All right. Then you have your value, your dark or your light shade. Okay, so your value is, let's say you have blue, let's say it's in the middle is royal blue. As you go with a darker, a deeper value, you have navy blue. As you go in the other direction, you go to a lighter value, you have a lighter color blue, Columbia blue, something like that. And then you have saturation. So saturation is the purity or the intensity of the color. And think of this as like pastel and neon. So saturation is like how much it grabs your eye or how much it soothes your eye. So if you have let's say a yellow color, if you go to a more pure version of it, you have a lighter yellow, maybe like a goldenrod or something like that, and that's soothing. You may they're very popular. That's a very popular color, for instance, for like sunrooms or something like that in the house, because it kind of soothes you. As opposed to the other end, you have a neon yellow that's intense and that grabs your eye. So if you have traffic signs, lines on the road, things that you want people to see right away, because that shows you, hey, caution, wet floor, neon yellow. All right, next we're going to talk about depth, and there's a couple elements of depth. So how far or close we perceive an object to be depends on a number of things with depth. So look at this picture. You obviously understand that this girl riding this skateboard is not enormous, right? You look at the Eiffel Tower and you can look at this two-dimensional image and you can recognize the visual cues that tell you she's closer. Why do you know she's closer? Well, because you know roughly the size of a human being. You assume, even if you've never seen the Eiffel Tower, that structure behind her is larger. And so therefore you use those cues to understand the depth, that she's much closer to you and that the Eiffel Tower is further away. But color also influences our perception of depth. So the darker mountains look closer and the farther away mountains look lighter. And there's obviously some are situated in front of the other ones, but this is another piece where color impacts how close and how far away we think things are. The lighter things are getting, the more we perceive them as being farther away. All right, and there's a lot of evolutionary advantages to this, because that helps us know, okay, how far away is that food? How far away is that water if we're thirsty? How far away is that shelter? How far away is that danger? So further on the idea of depth, we need to talk about how we are able to sense depth. And the way that we do this is through stereoscopic vision. That requires the two eyeballs we have up front of our face. All right, each eye receives a slightly different piece of information from what they're viewing, and you can see this. I'm sure you've done it. You look at an image, close one eye, close the other eye, and the images look slightly different, right? Especially if you put your hand very close to your face or an object very close to your face. The position of that object can be drastically different depending on which eye you're looking out of. As you can see on this illustration of this screen, each one of these eyes is viewing the cat from a slightly different perspective. And as a result, each eye is receiving that information, and our brain then takes that information and determines, how large that image is, how far away it is, what the shape of the object is, and they perceive it as three-dimensional vision, as a three-dimensional object with depth. Animals with their eyes situated directly in the front of their face, like ourselves, have better stereoscopic vision, right? So humans, birds of prey, cats, those sorts of things. Animals who have their eyes situated more on the side of their head, they have worse stereoscopic vision as far as being able to focus on an object, but the advantage is they have better peripheral vision. They can take in a wider amount of information from around them. That's useful if you are a prey animal, right, like a deer or something like that, where you want to be able to see a threat coming from all around you, and that's more important than being able to focus on something that's right in front of you. So we've talked about depth, we've talked about color. Now we want to talk about motion, okay? And of all the things we've discussed, movement is the thing that most powerfully demands our attention, all right? And again, all this stuff comes down to evolution, all right? If we see an animal approaching us, right, we need to figure out, is this animal food, or is this animal a threat, or is this animal totally innocent? Do we pursue it? Or do we flee? If we are hunting a thing and all of a sudden it goes into some brush and we don't see anything for a bit, and all of a sudden we see a quick thing of that thing coming out of that bush, it grabs our attention, because we know that that's probably the thing that we were chasing, that we need to catch and kill for us to eat and to continue to survive. In visual communication, motion is really an illusion, because most visual images we consume do not actually move. Even motion pictures do not actually move. So how do you tell that the image at right is in motion? One really common way to do that in still images is motion lines. You might think of, in a comic book, you see when someone punches, they'll have, swooshy lines behind it, or someone's flying, they'll have lines to show that, Superman is flying through the air. In this case, you can see the way that the exposure was done on the camera to show these streaking orangish lines. You can perceive that this, I believe it was a semi-truck or something of that nature, is moving quickly. So blur lines are one way to convey motion in a two-dimensional static image. But beyond that, beyond blurring the lines, there are two main ways that motion shows up in our perception and our sensing of static images. So number one is a concept called implied motion. An implied motion is an illusion movement within that single image, that you look at a single image and you say, from the cues that are given here, I can understand that there is motion here. And that really makes things like the blurring motion lines not necessary in a lot of cases. In this picture of this dog, there's no motion lines to be had, correct? But you still perceive that this dog is moving. How? Take a look. Look at this image for a couple minutes, and think about what clues tell you that the dog is moving. What direction is it moving in? Is it moving quickly or is it moving slowly? How do you know these things? And I won't fill that in for you. I want you to think about that, because I'm sure that you can come up with at least 3 or 4 different clues just by viewing this image. So this is implied motion. We just have we have a static image, and we can figure out that there's motion happening. The other way that motion can be perceived is through something called apparent motion. And apparent motion is how things like cartoons and motion pictures work. It occurs when we perceive motion in a rapid sequence of still images. All right. When you take a video of something, you're not actually taking a continuous video. You're taking a series of still images. Motion pictures display, if you've ever seen a film strip, thousands of still images running through a projector, or just running up or being flashed onto a screen that your brain perceives as movement. It's like a flip book. Have you ever seen a flip book? Similar images are drawn, you flip through it, it looks like something is actually happening. We see back-to-back still images in a slightly different position, and our brain logically assumes that the object moved, right? If you see a man is in this position, and all of a sudden he's in this position, and all of a sudden he's in this position, and all of a sudden he's in this position, you're going to assume that it's the same man moving his arms. Your brain is not going to assume logically that there are 5 different men, all with their arms in a different location. It's going to perceive that as movement. So, so those are kind of those elements of visual communication. Again, none of these ideas, except for maybe some of the Gestalt ideas, should totally be new to you. I think that, for instance, you all have known how motion pictures work, of the apparent motion and the applied motion of looking at an image and understanding that a dog is running versus sitting still. But now I want you to kind of think about those things. Think about, color and how saturation and depth and all those sorts of things are just stuff that you naturally perceive and never even think about. Because now, as we continue on this topic, we're going to start thinking about what those aspects actually do and why they matter to how you see the world around you.